The McDonnell Aircraft Corporation conference room in St. Louis smelled like coffee and desperation on a gray morning in February 1958. Chief designer Herman Barkey spread technical drawings across the table, while Navy procurement officers sat with arms crossed, already shaking their heads. The aircraft he'd spent 3 years perfecting, the F-4H-1 Phantom II, weighed 54,000 pounds fully loaded. Carrier fighters weren't supposed to exceed 35,000 pounds. The Navy men saw the twin General Electric J-79 engines, the 38-foot wingspan, the complex radar nose, and they saw money burning on a flight deck. "Gentlemen, this is a fighter bomber that thinks it's a strategic bomber," Captain William Searle said, tapping the gross weight specification with his pen. "Our carriers can't handle this." Barkey had heard it before. Every meeting, same objection. The Phantom demanded 2 engines when everyone knew single-engine designs meant lower costs and simpler maintenance. It required a 2-man crew, pilot and radar intercept officer. When the Air Force's new F-104 Starfighter proved one pilot could do everything. The radar system alone, the Westinghouse AN/APQ-72, cost more than entire Korean War-era fighters. And that wing design, with its distinctive 12-degree anhedral droop and 5-degree dihedral outer panels, looked like someone had bent it wrong in the factory. "Show them the interceptor runs from last month," Barkey told his assistant. The numbers didn't lie. During sea trials off the Virginia coast in January, test pilot Robert C. Little had pushed a prototype to Mach 2.23 at 47,000 feet. The F-4 could carry 8 air-to-air missiles, 4 radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrows recessed under the fuselage, 4 heat-seeking AIM-9 Sidewinders on wing pylons. No American fighter had ever carried that much firepower. The twin J-79s produced 17,000 pounds of thrust each with afterburners lit, giving the Phantom a thrust-to-weight ratio that let it accelerate vertically like a rocket. Captain Searle studied the performance data, then looked up. What happens when one of those engines flames out during a carrier approach? You've got a 27-ton brick with one engine fighting a crosswind at 130 knots. "Redundancy," Barkey replied. "Lose one engine, the other brings you home. Lose your only engine in a single-engine fighter. You eject and watch $50 million sink." The real problem sat unspoken in the room. McDonnell had designed the Phantom around a single assumption that made everyone nervous. Air combat was about to change forever. The era of dogfighting, turning, burning, guns blazing was ending. Future aerial warfare would happen at supersonic speeds beyond visual range. Missiles would do the killing before pilots ever saw each other. The Phantom's radar could track targets at 23 nautical miles and launch Sparrow missiles at 18 miles. By the time an enemy fighter got close enough to use guns, it would already be dead. "You're betting the Navy's entire fighter program on missiles that have never worked reliably in combat," Searle said. Barkey didn't flinch. "I'm betting on physics, speed, altitude, radar range. Those are measurable advantages. The side with superior technology wins." The Navy ordered 24 evaluation aircraft in December 1958, still unconvinced. Production contracts came reluctantly in 1959. The Phantom entered service in 1960 with Fleet Squadron VF-121, where pilots immediately complained about its size, its complexity, its insatiable fuel consumption. Too heavy, too expensive, too much airplane. The first F-4B Phantoms touched down at Da Nang Air Base on April 10, 1965. Their arrival covered in Navy press releases promising revolutionary air superiority. Commander Louis Page climbed out of his cockpit into 95-degree heat, sweat already soaking through his flight suit, and felt confident. His squadron, VF-96 Fighting Falcons, operated the most advanced fighter jet ever built. The North Vietnamese Air Force flew subsonic MiG-15s and MiG-17s, Korean War leftovers that looked like museum pieces next to the Phantom's sleek titanium fuselage. "We'll own the sky in 3 months," Page told his pilots during the first briefing. He was wrong in 6 weeks. June 17, 1965, 11:47 hours. Commander Jerry Houston and Lieutenant Commander Robert Dormus flew combat air patrol over Thanh Hoa Province at 20,000 feet, radar sweeping for targets. The AN/APQ-72 painted 2 contacts at 15 miles, closing fast. Houston's radar intercept officer, seated behind him in the cramped rear cockpit, called out firing solutions for the AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. Houston pickled off 2 Sparrows at 9 miles. Textbook engagement exactly as trained. Both missiles failed to guide. One went ballistic immediately, corkscrewing into jungle canopy. The second tracked for 4 seconds, then lost lock and self-destructed. The MiG-17s kept coming. At 3 miles, Houston identified them visually. Small, nimble fighters with distinctive mid-mounted wings. He tried launching AM-9 Sidewinders, but the heat seekers couldn't lock from a head-on aspect. The MiGs flashed past at a combined closure rate exceeding 1,200 miles per hour. Then they turned around. The MiG-17, designed in 1949, had one advantage American engineers never anticipated: a turn radius so tight it could reverse direction in less space than a football field. Houston tried following, lighting both afterburners, pulling 7 Gs into a hard bank. The Phantom's 54,000-pound mass fought him. The MiG-17 weighed 11,673 pounds empty, less than a quarter of the Phantom's weight, and its turn rate was devastating. Within 30 seconds, Houston found a silver fighter sitting 800 feet behind him, perfectly positioned in his blind spot. The North Vietnamese pilot opened fire with his 23mm Noodleman Richter NR-23 cannons. Shells walked up the Phantom's left engine, shredding turbine blades. Houston and Doremus ejected at 8,000 feet, landing in enemy territory. Both men spent 7 years in Hoa Lo Prison, the Hanoi Hilton. July 24th, another Phantom down. August 5th, 2 more. The kills followed identical patterns. American pilots fired missiles at long range, watched them fail, then found themselves in turning fights where the Phantom's superior speed and thrust meant nothing. The MiG-17's 3 cannons, 2 NR-23s and 1 37mm Noodleman N-37, fired 80 rounds per second combined. The F-4 Phantom carried 0 guns. By September 1965, the Navy had lost 8 F-4Bs to North Vietnamese fighters while shooting down only 3 MiGs. The exchange ratio horrified Pentagon planners who'd promised Congress the Phantom would dominate. Soviet instructors in Hanoi sent gleeful reports to Moscow describing American super fighters falling from the sky like wounded birds. Commander Page sat in the Da Nang Operations Center that September, staring at loss reports. His most advanced fighter, carrying 8 missiles and the best radar in the world, was losing to a subsonic gun platform. The technology advantage Barkey had promised, speed, altitude, radar range, worked beautifully until the fight went close. And in Vietnam, every fight went close. Lieutenant Commander Dick Bellinger slammed his helmet on the debriefing table at Da Nang on October 12, 1965. Still shaking from his 3rd failed engagement that month. I had the bastard at 1,500 feet, perfect 6 o'clock position, and my Sidewinder wouldn't lock because he was too close. Too close. What kind of fighter can't kill at 1,500 feet? The answer sat in classified Navy reliability reports that made grim reading. The AIM-7 Sparrow missile, the Phantom's primary weapon, achieved a kill probability of 8% in combat. For every 100 missiles fired, 92 missed or malfunctioned. The AIM-9 Sidewinder performed marginally better at 15%, but required tail-chase geometry and clean infrared signatures. In the twisting, turning knife fights over North Vietnam, neither missile worked as advertised. Bellinger wasn't alone in his frustration. By November 1965, squadron ready rooms across Da Nang and USS Enterprise echoed with the same demand. Put a gun on the Phantom. The Air Force's F-105 Thunder Chief carried an M61 Vulcan cannon, firing 6,000 rounds per minute. The Navy's own F-8 Crusader mounted 4 20mm Colt Mk-12 cannons and was racking up MiG kills in close combat. The F-4 carried nothing but missiles that failed 85% of the time. Guns are obsolete, Rear Admiral Thomas Connolly told assembled squadron commanders during a heated November briefing at Miramar Naval Air Station. Connolly, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air, had championed the missile-only Phantom since its inception. We're not going back to World War II tactics because pilots can't execute proper intercepts. The room erupted. Pilots stood shouting over each other. Commander Paul Gilchrist, who'd lost his wingman to a MiG-17 in September, pointed at Connolly. "Sir, with respect, my sparrows don't track in the tropical moisture. The humidity plays hell with the guidance system. And the rules of engagement require visual identification before firing, which puts us inside the missile minimum range." That last point cut deep. Political restrictions demanded American pilots visually confirm targets before shooting. No beyond visual range kills against potentially friendly aircraft. The Phantom's greatest advantage, its 23-mile radar detection range, became worthless. By the time pilots closed to visual range, roughly 2 miles, they'd entered the realm where the MiG-17's guns worked perfectly, and American missiles often didn't. Connolly remained unmoved. The solution is better missiles and better training, not reverting to gun platforms. The F-4 was designed for missile combat. Adding a gun pod affects performance, costs money, and won't solve the fundamental problem of pilot error. McDonnell aircraft engineers in St. Louis quietly disagreed. By January 1966, they'd tested an SUU-16 gun pod containing a 20mm M61A1 Gatling gun that could be mounted on the Phantom's centerline pylon. The pod carried 200 rounds and fired at 6,000 rounds per minute, the same weapon that made the F-105 lethal in close combat. The Navy rejected it for fleet-wide adoption. Too heavy, they said. The gun pod added 1,720 pounds and created drag that reduced the Phantom's range by 15%. Worse, firing the gun at high angles of attack caused gas ingestion into the engines, sometimes flaming them out. Admiral Connolly cited these technical problems as proof that guns didn't belong on modern fighters. Pilots kept dying anyway. December 1965. 2 more Phantoms down. January 1966. 3 more. The scorecard remained brutal. American missiles versus North Vietnamese cannons, and the cannons were winning. Captain Frank Ault sat in his Pentagon office on March 15, 1968, surrounded by 3 years of failure data that told an impossible story. The Navy had assigned him to investigate why the F-4 Phantom, the most sophisticated fighter ever built, maintained a kill ratio barely above 2-to-1 against obsolete North Vietnamese aircraft. His engineering background told him the hardware couldn't be this bad. The math didn't work. He'd spent 11 weeks interviewing 56 pilots, 34 radar intercept officers, 22 maintenance chiefs, and 17 weapons specialists across 7 air stations. What emerged wasn't a story about faulty missiles or missing guns. It was worse. American fighter pilots didn't know how to fight. The statistics horrified him. Fleet replacement squadrons spent 40 hours training pilots on administrative procedures and 4 hours on air combat maneuvering. Gunnery training had been eliminated in 1957 when the Navy decided missiles made it obsolete. Radar intercept officers received 0 instruction on how to guide missiles in high G turns or how atmospheric conditions affected Sparrow guidance. Maintainers never saw combat conditions. They certified missiles that worked perfectly on California test ranges, but failed in Vietnamese humidity. Ault's report, officially titled Air-to-Air Missile System Capability Review, ran 480 pages when delivered to Admiral Thomas Moorer on April 1, 1968. The opening summary pulled no punches. The tactical fighter community has lost the capability to train its pilots in basic fighter combat skills. Page 127 documented that 92% of Sparrow failures came from operator error, not hardware defects. Pilots fired outside the missile's launch envelope. Too close, too far, wrong altitude, wrong angle. The AAM-7E needed specific conditions. Target between 2 and 7 nautical miles, altitude differential less than 10,000 feet. Closure speed between 300 and 900 knots. Launch aircraft in stable flight pulling less than 2 Gs. violate any parameter, the missile failed. Nobody had taught pilots these numbers. Page 203 revealed that 64% of AIM-9 Sidewinder failures occurred because pilots fired at targets beyond the missile's kinematic range. The Sidewinder could only pull 18 Gs. A MiG-17 in a hard turn pulled 8 Gs. If the pilot fired while the target was turning, the missile couldn't catch up. Simple physics that nobody explained during training. Admiral Moore read the report and called Ault into his office on April 18th. "How do we fix this?" "Build a school," Ault said. "Not another training squadron. A graduate-level program that teaches the physics of air combat. Dissimilar aircraft, realistic scenarios, measurable outcomes. We need to create expert fighter pilots, not just qualified ones." Moore gave him 5 months and funding for one squadron. Ault chose NAS Miramar, pulled the Navy's 12 best fighter pilots from combat rotations, and stood up the Navy Fighter Weapons School on September 24, 1968. The name stuck faster. Top Gun. The curriculum focused on what Ault called energy management, understanding every engagement as a physics problem. Altitude equals potential energy. Speed equals kinetic energy. The pilot who managed his energy state better controlled the fight. They brought in A-4 Skyhawks and F-5 Tigers to simulate MiG-17s and MiG-21s. Instructors flew aggressive Soviet tactics, the same maneuvers killing Phantom pilots over Vietnam. Students learned their missiles' actual capabilities, not the manufacturer's optimistic brochures. They practiced radar intercepts in humid conditions, simulating tropical atmospheres that scattered radar beams. They learned to fight with guns, missiles, and finally, crucially, their brains. The first Top Gun graduates deployed to Vietnam in February 1969. Within 6 months, Navy kill ratios climbed from 2.4 to 1 to 8 to 1. Ault had been right. The airplane was never the problem. The real transformation arrived not in cockpits, but in radar laboratories 8,000 miles from Vietnam. Westinghouse engineer Donald Bowers stood in a Philadelphia testing facility on January 22, 1970, watching oscilloscope traces that represented 3 years of classified development work. The AWG-10 pulse-doppler radar system he designed for the new F-4J model could do something Soviet engineers considered impossible: track low-flying aircraft against ground clutter. Traditional radars, including the Phantom's original AN/APQ-72, worked by sending out radio pulses and measuring returned echoes. One catastrophic problem: ground returns. Radar reflections from terrain, buildings, trees, created a blizzard of false signals that masked actual aircraft. Flying below 1,000 feet made any fighter effectively invisible to conventional radars. North Vietnamese pilots exploited this ruthlessly, diving to treetop level whenever American fighters approached. Bowers' pulse-doppler system operated on different physics. Instead of measuring signal strength, it measured frequency shifts caused by target motion, the Doppler effect that makes ambulance sirens change pitch as they pass. A MiG-21 flying at 600 knots created a distinct frequency shift. The stationary ground below created zero frequency shift. The radar signal processor, built around 1/200 discrete transistors and 480 integrated circuits, could separate moving targets from stationary clutter with 94% accuracy. The difference in combat was surgical. Lieutenant Jerry Bollier, flying an F-4J off USS Constellation on March 28, 1970, locked his new pulse-doppler radar onto a MiG-21 hugging a ridgeline at 400 feet altitude. His radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Steve Barkley, watched the target hold steady on the display, despite mountainous terrain directly behind it. "Sparrow away," Barkley called, launching an AIM-7E2 missile from 12 miles. The AIM-7E2 represented the missile half of the revolution. Raytheon engineers had redesigned the guidance section with solid-state electronics that resisted humidity and improved tracking algorithms that maintained lock through evasive maneuvers. Combined with pulse-doppler illumination from the launching aircraft, the new Sparrow achieved a 42% kill probability, 5 times better than earlier variants. The MiG-21 pilot never knew he was targeted until the missile detonated 15 feet from his cockpit. The continuous rod warhead, 33 pounds of explosives wrapped with steel rods, severed the aircraft's tail section. Soviet investigators later found the wreckage and couldn't determine how an American missile had tracked their fighter below radar horizons. By July 1970, the Navy had deployed 84 F-4J aircraft equipped with pulse-doppler radars and AIM-7E2 missiles. The combination created a capability gap that terrified Soviet air defense planners. Their doctrine relied on low-altitude penetration to defeat radar-guided missiles. Now altitude provided no sanctuary. American fighters could detect, track, and kill targets in the weeds, the exact regime where Soviet fighters thought they were safest. Technical intelligence reports from Hanoi to Moscow in August 1970 bordered on panic. Soviet advisors documented American missiles tracking through terrain masking, making kills at altitudes where radar guidance should be impossible. One report, declassified in 1992, stated, "Enemy radar demonstrates capabilities inconsistent with known Western technology. Recommend immediate evaluation of all defensive tactics." The North Vietnamese adapted by staying even lower, below 200 feet, and tightening their turn radii to break radar locks. But flying that low at high speeds was exhausting and dangerous. Pilots who survived American missiles often hit trees or misjudged terrain clearance. The psychological advantage shifted. Soviet instructors who'd once taught aggressive offensive tactics now emphasized survival. Avoid American fighters whenever possible. Bowers never deployed to Vietnam. He spent the war in Philadelphia, refining algorithms and improving signal processing. But his radar changed the calculus of every engagement after 1970. The hunter had become invisible. May 10, 1972, 09:15 hours. The morning briefing aboard USS Constellation revealed what Navy pilots had waited 7 years to hear. Operation Linebacker. Unrestricted air strikes against North Vietnamese targets, including Hanoi itself. President Nixon had lifted most political restrictions after North Vietnam's Easter Offensive invasion. For the first time since 1965, American fighters could engage enemy aircraft without requesting permission from Washington. Lieutenant Commander Mike Connolly launched from Constellation's Catapult 2 at 10:47 hours, his F-4J carrying 4 AIM-7E2 Sparrows and 4 AIM-9G Sidewinders. His radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Tom Blonsky, powered up the AN/AWG-10 pulse-doppler radar as they climbed through 15,000 feet, heading northwest toward Haiphong. The radar painted contacts immediately. Red Crown, the Navy's Airborne Control Center, was calling out multiple MiG launches from Kep and Phuc Yen air bases. "We've got 8 bandits, various altitudes, 40 miles northwest," Blonsky called from the rear cockpit. The North Vietnamese were throwing everything available into the air. MiG-21s, MiG-19s, even old MiG-17s. Soviet advisors had ordered mass scrambles to overwhelm American strike packages. What they didn't know: every American fighter pilot now carried 3 years of Top Gun training and pulse-doppler radar that could track all 8 targets simultaneously. Connolly selected the nearest MiG-21 at 23 miles, descending through 8,000 feet, exactly where earlier radars would have lost it in ground clutter. His radar held lock. At 14 miles, he launched an AIM-7E2. The Sparrow guided perfectly, riding the pulse-doppler beam straight to the target. The MiG-21 exploded at 11:04 hours. First kill of Operation Linebacker. 3 miles north, Lieutenant Kurt Dosay locked another MiG-21 at 19 miles. His AIM-7 hit at 11:06. Lieutenant Winston Copeland splashed a MiG-19 at 11:09. Commander Harry Blackburn killed a MiG-21 attempting to dive away at 11:12. The pulse-doppler radar tracked it down to 300 feet altitude before the Sparrow connected. By 11:18 hours, 6 MiGs were burning on the ground or falling through the sky. The remaining 2 North Vietnamese pilots fled west at full afterburner, abandoning the fight. Total engagement time: 14 minutes. 0 American losses. Soviet advisors monitoring from Phuc Yen couldn't process what their radios were reporting. Vietnamese pilots transmitted frantic warnings about American missiles guiding through the mountains and below the clouds. Descriptions that violated everything Soviet radar theory said was possible. Colonel Yevgeny Pepelayev, a Korean war ace sent to advise the Vietnamese Air Force, sent an urgent coded message to GRU headquarters in Moscow that afternoon. Enemy radar capabilities exceed all intelligence estimates. Our low-altitude sanctuary doctrine is completely compromised. Request immediate technical assessment. The kills continued throughout May 10th. By sunset, Navy F-4s had destroyed 8 MiGs without loss. May 11th brought 4 more kills. May 12th, 6 more. The North Vietnamese stopped launching mass formations. Soviet instructors cabled Moscow requesting emergency upgrades for their own MiG-23 fighters, suddenly aware that American technology had leaped ahead while they'd been complacent. In Philadelphia, Donald Bowers received a classified cable summarizing the May 10th engagements. His pulse-doppler radar had performed exactly as calculated. Every target tracked, every missile guided. But reading the kill reports gave him no satisfaction. He thought about the North Vietnamese pilots who died never understanding what hunted them, flying defensive tactics that no longer worked, trusting Soviet doctrine that had become obsolete overnight. Technology changed wars faster than doctrines could adapt. On May 10, 1972, the North Vietnamese learned that lesson at 600 miles per hour. Lieutenant Randy Cunningham rolled inverted at 18,000 feet over Haiphong Harbor at 10:08 hours on May 10, 1972, and spotted what he'd been hunting for 3 years. A formation of MiG-17s climbing through scattered clouds 6,000 feet below. His radar intercept officer, Lieutenant William Driscoll, called out the geometry. 4 bogeys, 11 o'clock low, ascending turn. This was Cunningham's 31st mission over North Vietnam. He'd scored 2 previous kills, a MiG-21 on January 19th and another MiG-17 on May 8th. Navy regulations required 5 kills for ace status, a designation only 2 American pilots had achieved in Vietnam. Every fighter pilot in the Navy wanted to be number 3. Cunningham wanted it more. He pulled his F-4J into a 7G dive, afterburners roaring, accelerating through 650 knots. The lead MiG-17 reversed hard left, exactly the mistake Cunningham had learned to exploit at Top Gun. The MiG pilot was thinking in 2 dimensions, turn radius and airspeed. Cunningham thought in 3. Energy state management. He'd traded 12,000 feet of altitude for speed, converting potential energy to kinetic. Now he could climb vertically, while the MiG, slow and low, couldn't follow. Cunningham pulled into a near-vertical climb, bleeding speed deliberately, watching the MiG-17 try to follow. The North Vietnamese pilot pulled too hard, stalled, and snap-rolled left. Cunningham rolled with him, inverted now at 8,000 feet with 0 airspeed, hanging on his afterburners. He pickled off an AEM-9G Sidewinder in pure position firing. No sophisticated lock, just geometry and timing. The missile tracked perfectly into the MiG's tailpipe. Kill number 3, 10:12 hours. 2 more climbing, right 3 o'clock, Driscoll shouted. Cunningham reversed right, spotted 2 MiG-17s in loose formation, climbing through 6,000 feet. He selected the wingman, got a clean AEM-9 tone, fired at 4,000 feet range. The Sidewinder guided true. The improved AEM-9G variant had a wider seeker head and better tracking filters. The MiG's right wing separated at the root. Kill number 4, 10:15 hours. Then the radio call that changed everything. Bandits engaging strike group. All fighters press north. Cunningham turned toward the voice and saw chaos. 8 MiG-17s had jumped a formation of A-7 Corsair attack aircraft, and the slower attack planes couldn't shake them. He lit both afterburners, accelerating back to 620 knots, and locked the nearest MiG with his pulse-doppler radar. The MiG pilot reacted instantly, not fleeing, but turning into Cunningham with aggressive precision. This wasn't a standard North Vietnamese formation pilot. The MiG executed a perfect high yo-yo, gaining altitude while maintaining position. Cunningham countered with a low yo-yo, diving below the MiG and converting altitude to speed again. For 3 minutes, both aircraft spiraled through the sky in a pure energy fight. Neither pilot made mistakes. Every move had a counter. Cunningham recognized what he was facing. An instructor pilot, probably Soviet, definitely experienced. Later intelligence would identify him as Colonel Nguyen Toon, credited with 13 American kills. At 10:19 hours, Cunningham saw his opening. Toon had pulled vertical, but his speed had dropped below 200 knots. Cunningham pulled lag pursuit, staying behind and low, and waited for Toon to stall. The MiG-17 hung nose-high for 2 seconds, completely vulnerable. Cunningham fired his last AEM-9G from 2,500 feet. The missile hit the MiG's engine section. Cunningham saw the canopy separate, saw the ejection seat fire. Colonel Toon descended into Haiphong Harbor under a white parachute. Kill number 5. 10:20 hours. Randy Cunningham had become the first American ace of the Vietnam War. The GRU technical intelligence briefing in Moscow on June 3, 1972, began with satellite photographs that Soviet analysts initially dismissed as American disinformation. Major General Pyotr Ivashutin, deputy chairman of the GRU, studied reconnaissance images showing 23 destroyed MiG aircraft at North Vietnamese air bases, losses sustained in just 3 weeks of Operation Linebacker. The exchange ratio had collapsed to 12-1 in America's favor. These numbers are impossible, Colonel Vladimir Babich, Chief Radar Systems Analyst, told the assembled officers. Our MiG-21 carries the RP-21 Sapphire radar. The Americans cannot track our aircraft below 2,000 meters. Our doctrine is sound. Ivashutin slid a decoded Vietnamese message across the table. One of 47 similar reports from Hanoi describing American missiles guiding through terrain masking, tracking targets at altitudes where conventional radars should see only ground return. Soviet advisors in Vietnam had initially attributed these to pilot panic or American propaganda, but the wreckage told different stories. On May 18th, North Vietnamese forces had recovered substantial pieces of an F-4J shot down by anti-aircraft fire near Vinh. The aircraft's AWG-10 radar system survived relatively intact. 8 of 12 major components were analyzable. Soviet technicians crated the wreckage and flew it to Moscow's TSAGI research facility, where engineers spent 2 weeks examining Westinghouse's pulse-doppler design. Their report, completed on June 2, contradicted everything Soviet radar doctrine assumed about American capabilities. The AWG-10 didn't operate like traditional radars at all. Instead of amplitude-based target detection, it used frequency discrimination, measuring Doppler shifts as small as 100 Hz to separate aircraft from stationary clutter. The signal processor contained 1/200 transistors performing real-time fast Fourier transforms, mathematical operations that required computing power. Soviet designers had considered impossible to package in an airborne system. The Americans have deployed airborne computers, the TSAGI report concluded. Their radar is not detecting targets. It is calculating target motion and discriminating based on velocity vectors. The implications terrified Soviet air defense planners. Every Soviet fighter doctrine since 1955 relied on low-altitude penetration to defeat radar-guided missiles. The MiG-21's primary defensive tactic involved diving below 500 meters where ground clutter would mask its radar signature. Vietnamese pilots had executed this maneuver thousands of times successfully between 1965 and 1970. Now it was suicide. Worse, the captured radar revealed that American missiles, specifically the AEM-7E2 Sparrow, received continuous guidance updates during flight. Soviet missiles like the K-13, a reverse-engineered Sidewinder copy, were fire-and-forget weapons that couldn't be updated after launch. The American system meant a F-4 radar could track a maneuvering target, calculate predicted intercept points, and transmit course corrections to the missile in real time. Soviet engineers called it command guidance on steroids. On June 15, 1972, the Soviet Ministry of Aviation Industry issued Emergency Directive 24372, ordering immediate upgrades to the MiG-23 Flogger program. Engineers at Mikoyan-Gurevich received funding for pulse-doppler radar development, technology they dismissed as unnecessary 5 years earlier. The timeline demanded operational systems by 1975, an impossible schedule that would require abandoning existing designs and starting fresh. Colonel Babbage spent that summer redesigning Soviet air combat doctrine. The low-altitude sanctuary was gone. The turning fight advantage of lighter fighters was negated by missiles that killed beyond visual range. Soviet pilots would need to fight American Phantoms the way Americans had intended to fight since 1958. At long range, with superior radar, using missiles that worked. It had taken 7 years, 150 dead MiG pilots, and 1 crashed F-4J for Soviet planners to understand what Herman Barkey had known in 1958. The missile age had arrived. They'd just been fighting the wrong war. The final accounting came in a Pentagon briefing room on January 27, 1973, the day the Paris Peace Accords ended American involvement in Vietnam. Air Force Colonel James R. McCarthy stood before a wall-sized board displaying 8 years of air combat statistics, numbers that would define fighter aircraft procurement for the next 3 decades. F-4 Phantom kills against North Vietnamese aircraft, 150 confirmed. F-4 losses to enemy fighters, 33. Exchange ratio, 4.5 to 1 overall, 12.3 to 1 after Top Gun training and pulse-doppler radar deployment in 1970. The doubters had been catastrophically wrong. The breakdown told the story of technological evolution under fire. Between 1965 and 1968, Navy and Air Force Phantoms had struggled to a 2.4 to 1 kill ratio using unreliable AIM-7D and AIM-7E missiles with conventional radars. Pilots complained about the lack of guns, and they weren't entirely wrong. Gun pods accounted for 14 confirmed kills during this period. But the gun wasn't the answer. Training and technology were. After Top Gun's establishment in September 1968 and the deployment of F-4J models with AN/AWG-10 pulse-doppler radars starting in 1970, the numbers became one-sided. Navy Phantoms alone destroyed 38 MiGs in 1972, while losing only 2 aircraft to enemy fighters. The Air Force, which added gun pods to F-4E variants and conducted similar training reforms, achieved comparable results. The final 18 months of American air operations looked less like combat and more like technological demonstration. Herman Barkey lived to see the vindication. He retired from McDonnell Douglas in 1978 after the Phantom had entered service with 11 foreign air forces and set 15 world records for speed, altitude, and climb rate. The fighter that Navy procurement officers called too heavy in 1958 became the most successful Western fighter of the Cold War, with 5,195 aircraft built across 30 years of production. The aircraft served the U.S. Navy until 1986, the Air Force until 1996. Israel flew Phantoms in combat until 2004. Turkey kept them operational until 2017. Iran, which purchased 225 F-4s before the 1979 revolution, still operates modified variants today. The fighter dismissed as too complex, too expensive, and too dependent on unreliable missiles outlasted 3 generations of supposedly superior replacements. Soviet engineers learned painful lessons from those 150 kills. The MiG-23 received pulse-doppler radar in 1975. The MiG-29, designed in response to the Phantom's dominance, entered service in 1983 with look-down or shoot-down capability and beyond visual range missiles. Exactly the capabilities Soviet planners had dismissed as impractical 15 years earlier. The technology gap that opened over Vietnam in 1972 drove Soviet military aviation development for 2 decades. The gun debate never fully died. The F-4E's internal M61 Vulcan cannon scored 5 kills in Vietnam, and advocates cited this as proof that guns remained relevant. But context mattered. Those 5 kills came from 186,000 rounds fired, a 0.003% hit rate. Meanwhile, AIM-7E2 and AIM-9G missiles achieved 39% and 19% kill probabilities respectively after 1970. The physics favored missiles just as Barkey had predicted in 1958. On March 14, 1996, the last operational U.S. Air Force F-4G Wild Weasel landed at Holloman Air Force Base, ending 36 years of American Phantom operations. The fighter had flown 423,000 combat sorties, survived 3 wars, and proved that complex, expensive, missile-armed aircraft could dominate when properly employed. The Navy procurement officers who dismissed it in 1958 were all dead by then. The Phantom flew on.